Thank you so much for coming again. I'm going to turn the floor over to Professor Steinfeld real quickly, but just to introduce him, he's a professor of political science at Yale University and also the director of the China Initiative at the Watson Institute for International Studies. And he taught for many years at MIT before. But Professor Steinfeld, it's yours.
Great, thank you. Thank you all for coming today, and thank you to the Hong Kong Students Association for putting together really an amazing day. I really am grateful to you all. It's my pleasure today to introduce the panel on Hong Kong and the greater China context. Let me just maybe very quickly do introductions, very brief introductions, and each one of our panelists will speak for about 15 minutes or so. And then Charles Mock, who you know, but I'll introduce again in a moment, will give some comments on all of the presentations, and then we'll open it up to everybody's questions, and I will simply sit back and moderate a little bit. So our first speaker today will be Huei-Ying, who is a senior lecturer and research scientist in the field of sociology at Johns Hopkins University. Huei-Ying has expertise in transnational business networks, historically, in Hong Kong and Singapore and Greater China, really focusing on the 19th century all the way through the early to mid-20th century. And Professor Guo mentioned to me that her book is just in process, or just about to come out in the spring. So we'll be eager to hear a presentation on that topic. Then following Professor Guo, we'll have David Wyss, who teaches, here at Brown. He's been a fellow at the Watson Institute and has taught in the IR program. He's taught a number of courses on economics. David is an economist with extensive experience in the business sector and Standard & Poor's, and also extensive experience in the public sector as well on the Council of Economic Advisors of the President. And our last speaker today will be Weiping, an old friend and colleague of mine, who is now teaching at Tufts University, where she directs. She's the chair of the program on urban studies. She has tremendous expertise on urbanization in China. For those of you taking my courses, you'll note that her book, the latest book on urban China, is assigned on both of my syllabi. And then lastly, Charles Mock, who you've already met, a member of the LegCo, with tremendous experience in the public sector, in the think tank sector, social entrepreneurial sector, and the tech sector, will provide some comments just at the end. Great, thank you. So just let me turn it over now to Professor Guo.
Thank you for my presentation today about Chinese overseas bureaucracy in the General Guangdong Hong Kong strike and boycott. It is an excerpt of chapter 2 of my forthcoming book, Network Beyond Empire. And then in the book, I try to analyze the connection between the Chinese bureaucracy or Chinese elites in British colonial Hong Kong as well as Singapore, and then how together they formulated an automatic zone in terms of their strategies to respond to both the expansion of Japanese power beginning from the over 1 year, and also to effectively construct their own agenda to respond to the mobilization of Chinese nationalism. And then in the subject about General Guangdong Hong Kong strike and boycott, that has been a hot topic in the research about British colonial Hong Kong, because it has been very successful from the perspective of the communist leaders, Chinese communist leader, in terms of how it effectively devastated the economy of Hong Kong for 16 years, between June 1925 to October 1926. And then also, I think the most important research about that will be Ming Chen's work about General Hong Kong strike and boycott, and also Chen Lao Qi-Jing, and also Cai Rongbang's research about Hong Kong's history, to look at Hong Kong history from the perspective of modern Chinese development. or John Carroll, I mean, they have all concluded how significant the movement was to give the Chinese bourgeoisie in Hong Kong a lesson about how effective communist mobilization could challenge the British supremacy in South China, in the Hong Kong. And then what in the paper that I presented here, I just gave the paper to Larry yesterday. I will emphasize that first of all, it is for sure that this movement really manifested the continuity of what we call the new cultural May 4th movement, in which the anti-imperialist ideology became a very effective tool to mobilize the Chinese mass to confront with the British interests. But the second thing is that by looking at the processes in which how the strike committee, or the leading agency in Guangdong that plan all the strategies to defiscate Hong Kong's economy. And we will also find out it's kind of, on one hand, in terms of ideology, it was the continuity of those anti-imperial strategies developed around the new cultural and May 4th moment. But by looking at the way that the strike committee in the 1925 to responded the Japanese interest in the Guangdong Hong Kong area, and we will also find out the shifting strategy or shifting discourse in the anti-imperialist movement. In terms of in this, we know that the anti-imperialist ideology became a dominant discourse in Chinese nationalism. Came from the anti-Japanese boycott from the New Cultural Movement and May 4th Movement 1915 and 1919. And then, I mean, so Japan was pretty much framed as the primary imperialist power. They tried to take advantage of Chinese national interests in that juncture. But in the Guangdong Hong Kong strike boycott, or considered as the largest anti-imperialist movement, Japan was not considered as an enemy at all. And in the archive that I found at the second historical archive in Nanjing, and it shows that in September 1925, or the 4th month after the boycott, and Japanese South Sea Golddown House, this is a very important state-sponsored company of the Japanese Empire to expand its business interest to South China and Southeast Asia from the year of World War I. And then this particular company mandated all merchants in Guangdong, if they wish to retrieve rice stock stored in a warehouse, they must hire coolies from among those who pass a background check. And then the consideration would be to make sure that the Japanese interests would not become targets of the boycott. And then in this moment, Chinese merchants thought it would be, it would be kind of troublesome to really check the backgrounds of the coolie they hire. And then so they thought the Japanese regulation was difficult to follow. And then, but at that time, Fu Bingchang in the Canton government, or he was in charge of the Guangdong Maritime Custom, and then he helped Chinese merchants to really negotiate with the Japanese consulate in Canton or Guangzhou. And the Guangdong government's expectation is clearly that we will have to make sure that even during the time when we were boycotting against the British interests, we wanted to keep friendly diplomatic ties between China, which means the Guangdong government, and Japan. So it really shows this movement primarily targeted against the British, and while it kind of modified the original anti-imperial discourse in which Japan's were considered as allies of the communist or the anti-imperialist movement. And also, the existing study have also pointed out how this 16 months of strike become a test for the collaboration between the rightists and leftists in Kuomintang, the Chinese National Party in Guangdong, and how Chinese bourgeoisie in Hong Kong, especially those leading elites that we have, I think you must have read, from another study about the formation of Chinese colonial elites in British Hong Kong in the 19th century, like from the Donghua Hospital, Elizabeth Singh's representative study, and from Carl Smith's research, I mean, they all pointed out that the recent work about John Carroll, they have all pointed out that the British support was the key, I mean, for the rise of group of selective Chinese elites in Hong Kong. And then at that moment, when Hong Kong became the target of Chinese anti-British movement, and then these elites, they skillfully work to play the politics, I mean, in terms of the left-right conflict in Guangdong, and then they skillfully help the British to negotiate and to cooperate with the rightists in Guangdong, especially those people who work closely with Chiang Kai-shek. And then, so after the end of the movement, Zhou Shoucheng, or the first, or I think he was part. I mean, there's also a long story about how his connection, or his being a representative of Chinese elites in colonial Hong Kong, in a way that he was part of the Hartford kids, or he went to study in North America along with Lei Qing's education reform in 1860s, and then later on he worked for Li Hongzhang in to revise the maritime customs system, not only in Tianjin but also in Korea. And then Zhou Shoucheng, after the collapse of Qing Empire, and he retired to Hong Kong, and then also worked closely with those Donghua elites, or the Chinese General Chamber of Commerce. And then he was the key leader who helped the Chinese business community to overcome all the challenges in the 16 months of strike. So eventually he was appointed as a Chinese member at the Executive Council in spring 1926. And and then this was considered as a very important I won't say token, but I mean as kind of to honor the Chinese acceptance of the British status quo, and also the rejection of Chinese bourgeoisie in Hong Kong to the anti-imperialist discourse. I mean the discourse is still, I mean, also shifted from treating Japan as the enemy in the late 1920s and to looking at Japan as a friendly diplomatic alliance, while targeting only the British interests in the 1920s. And so, if we look at this in the Chinese bourgeois status in response to the anti-imperialist movement, and then from a nationalist discourse, or from the perspective of the leftists who staged and led the strike and boycott in the mid-1920s, and then they would look at people like Zhou Shoucheng, or the Chinese bourgeois, it is as in the words of Deng Zhongxia, the leader who was responsible for the anti-British strikes in the 1920s. And he would frame people like Zhou Shoucheng as, quote, cold-blooded foreign slaves who have acted in the same way as jackals do for a lion, I mean, unquote. I mean, so that is a very nasty view to frame the Chinese bourgeoisie. It is, I mean, from leftist nationalist discourse, I mean, as the enemy, I mean, together with Hong Kong as part of the problem of Chinese national solidarity. And then by existing study, I mean, but we look at the history, I mean, modern Chinese history from the Hong Kong perspective. And then, as I mentioned before, that the scholar like Weiping and Carl Smith and like John Carroll or Cai Rongfang, I mean, he is one of, I will find is a Taiwanese, Taiwan-originated scholar who does a big contribution to Hong Kong history. I mean, they have all they coined the concept. I mean, all their historiography about the tension between the status of Chinese bourgeoisie in between the mobilization of Chinese nationalism as well as the support of British colonial status quo. They coined a concept called collaborative nationalism, and then to frame the Chinese bourgeoisie, or the group of people who established their wealth and power under the British colonial status quo from the 19th century, along the concept called collaborative nationalism. And then so this is actually become a kind of paradigm to look at Hong Kong as a place in between China and British Empire in the early 20th century, when Chinese nationalism become a dominant discourse, and also the British Empire started to decline. And then there's a group of people, they will have to kind of struggle in between these two competing requests about their political loyalty. And then, but in the paper I read here also is part of, I think, very important argument in the book that have just been accepted for publication. And then I try to emphasize that beyond, I mean, the demands of Chinese nationalism from mainland China, as well as the expectation for Chinese subject in a British colony to follow the British colonial status quo. There was another important factor that we tend to overlook. That is the expansion of Japanese interests from the years of World War I. And then in terms of the general Guangdong Hong Kong and strike and boycott, and the expansion of the Japanese factor, I mean, played an important role in terms of how, first of all, it become an alternative, I would say, supply of some products after the strike committee decided to target only the British interests, and Japan, the supply from Japan will become an alternative source. But at the same time, as you can see from the map that around the time beginning from 1912, when Japan started to sponsor the shipping network from Taiwan, it was part of Japanese colony around the time, and from Taiwan to Southeast Asia, and Hong Kong was also developed into a very important midway station for the Japanese southward expansion. And then alongside the Japanese plan to expand its economic influence in the region, as a larger part, I mean, this is American, Philippines, Dutch East Indies, and then later on Japan worked hard to penetrate in the market of Singapore and British Malaya. After this, I think this is a map is based on the map of 1916, and then Singapore later on rose to be a very important stop after 1919. And then Japan also tried to recruit Chinese, I would say, ethnic Chinese merchants with overseas background or with connection of Hong Kong or Taiwan, and to work to penetrate or to befriend and to form alliance with those Chinese bourgeoisie who have been accepted by the Western colonizer. For example, like people in the Chinese General Chamber of Commerce in Hong Kong or Singapore Chinese Chamber of Commerce. And then, okay, I mean, I think here, because I know that we have to focus on the general Hong Kong general Guangdong Hong Kong strike and boycott. And in this boycott, one particular leaders, I mean, in that work with Japan and then to allies with the Chinese bourgeoisie in Hong Kong who were suffering from the attacks from the leftists in Hong Kong, was a guy called Guo Chunyang or Guo Dingyang. I mean, in Hong Kong there's a street actually called Chunyang Jie. And then it is in North Point. And I'm from Taiwan. My native language is Hokkien or Taiwanese. I mean, so when I go there, I mean, even just last summer, I could really, communicate with people with the wet market or Chunyang. I mean, a lot of people there are still speaking Hokkien, that language. And Guo Chunyang have land, around in North Point. And then the interesting thing is that Guo Chunyang, he was working. He was born in Hokkien or the Fujian speaking area in South Fujian, but then he been by 1920, he have been a very important merchants to export the tea from Japanese Taiwan to Dutch East Indies along the shipping route we just saw. And he also invested in the export of Java sugar to Hong Kong, and he has a school, the Fujian school in North Point. And then in January 1926. 7 months after the strike and boycott broke out, and Guo Chunyang volunteered to the British consulate in Shanghai, and he asked the British to buy he asked British to buy his property in North Point in Beijiao, and then he would say, okay, I think my property was worth about $13 million, and then if British was willing to buy this, and I could use half of the money and to hire to persuade Wu Peifu or the northern military leader in Beijing and to set to attack the Guangdong government. And then so it was his strategies. I mean to help we on the one hand we would think this was the guy who worked for the Japanese interests, while the Chinese bourgeoisie in Hong Kong, they were really anglicized Chinese, or they were Chinese, but they were they realize, they know that they will have to support the British colonial status quo, especially in terms of the economic order in Hong Kong. And then, but somehow Guo Chunyang was sympathetic to the status of the bourgeoisie in Hong Kong. And the British didn't really accept the proposal, but from this event, we know the kind of connection between Chinese overseas bourgeoisie. I mean, those people, they have they work, they live, and they make their profit, operated their trade outside China, and then they formulated what we could call as the transnational connections. And then in 2 months after Guo Chunyang's proposal to help the British to hire army from Beijing, I mean to really to use a military force to end the strike and boycott. And Guo Chunyang was together with other Hogan or Southern Fujian merchants in Manila, Malaya, and Taiwan, and then they have their own Hogan Sojourners Home Saving Association. I mean, they work together, and then they try to invest into the development of Fujian. And then many of these people, I think Guo Chunyang himself, as well as some of his business partners in Singapore, the Ho Hong Group or Hefeng Jifan, I mean, they were also members of the Fujian Shanghui or the Fujian Chamber of Commerce in Hong Kong in the 1920s. And then this association was, focused mainly. I mean, the rationale of founding the association was to develop a railway project in Minnan or in southern Fujian. But then after 1930s, they became very active to sponsor a military leader originally from the Guangdong army. I mean, to have a more like a political automatic movement in Fujian in 1933. And then in that process, I mean, they would meet in Hong Kong. I mean, there was some mention at Robinson Road become a place they were met and to talk about how to develop. I mean, or how to develop their political agenda, I mean, to change the politics in South China. So I think what I really want to say from looking at Japanese archive and also to looking at the connection between Chinese bourgeoisie in Hong Kong and those in Southeast Asia or Taiwan is to emphasize more like that the place of Hong Kong, even in the colonial time, was not just a place between the demands of Chinese nationalist power as well as the expectation of sustaining the British colonial status quo. We will have to look at the Hong Kong bourgeoisie at a broader framework, and especially with their connection with other overseas Chinese merchants in the region. I mean, not only just China and the British Empire, but the broader Southeast region. And then the other thing is to look at the multifarious forms of Chinese nationalist identity. I mean, there was not just one form of nationalism, although this is in the national discourse. I mean, there would only be one explicit acceptable agenda, like in the middle of 1920s, and the right way. I mean, the official sanctioned right way would be to confront with the British power, and then but that position, I mean, and whoever confronted with position would be considered as kind of slavery of Western imperialist power or traitor to the nation. And then, but if we look at the connection or the contribution to the development of China at large, I mean, not necessarily something consistent with the official discourse. I mean, there are several forms of nationalism, and so I think that is what I want to emphasize in the presentation.
Professor David Wyss.
I'd like to do is take us really into a more narrow section of Hong Kong's development, which is the development of the financial sector in Hong Kong, and how that relates to the rest of Asia, how it relates to the unification of Hong Kong with China, and what some of the risks and opportunities involved in that are. Up through the 1980s and 1990s, there were really two major international financial centers in Asia, Hong Kong and Singapore. The two have a lot in common. There were two out of the four tigers after World War II. They were both British foundations. You have to realize both Hong Kong and Singapore were there were no real settlements there until the British put them in. Hong Kong had a small fishing village. Singapore was about the same. They were put there in part because there were no native settlements in the area. The British had a free hand, which the British always liked. And Hong Kong, of course, grew up because up until the first Opium War, the only place that non-Chinese were allowed, Europeans were allowed to trade with China was through Canton, Guangdong. Only after the first Opium War was that opened up to some other treaty ports. And of course, it was after the first Opium War that Britain was given Hong Kong as the island to run. It's important because of that. Hong Kong became the center for international trade, international financial transactions, really for all of China. Shanghai was a bit of a competitor before World War II. Hong Kong was always the more important of the two. HSBC, the H comes before the S. Hong Kong Shanghai Banking Corporation. And the headquarters are back in Hong Kong. They didn't try to move them back to the Blunting Shanghai. Up through the 1990s, those were the only two major centers. And to understand why they're the only two major centers, you have to understand what you need to have in order to be a financial center. You know, what are the real requirements? First thing you need is predictable legal regulations. Since Hong Kong and Singapore both had basically British legal systems, this was true in both of them. People knew what the rules were, what could be done, what couldn't be done. You needed easy clearance and free clearance of international financial transactions, i.e. no currency controls. Because if people are, investors can get really scared when you mention the word currency controls, and they go away in a hurry. You need a city which is very amenable to having foreigners living in the city. Both Hong Kong and Singapore, in part because they started as British colonies, so they both had a heavy British influence, had that. Both cities are predominantly Chinese. Hong Kong is Hong Kong is basically 100% Chinese at this point. Singapore is about 85% Chinese. So both cities are predominantly Chinese, but English is a common, if not, Singapore really more common than Chinese on the street. Hong Kong is not quite that way. But you can get by without having to learn Chinese. You can live there as a foreigner fairly comfortably, although some of my friends who lived over there have complaints, but that's another story. And they, schooling, you had schools that the children could go to that were reasonably consistent with the organizational structure of British American schools. It was a fairly comfortable place for foreigners to live, and that's an important consideration for being an international financial center. It's one reason, incidentally, why Tokyo has never really developed as an international financial center. It's much more insular, it's much harder for a non-Japanese to be resident in Tokyo, unless you're either married to a Japanese and speak Japanese. It's much more difficult than it is to be in Hong Kong. And sort of up through the 1990s, those were the considerations which made Hong Kong and Singapore basically the competitors for the title of lead financial center. And there was a lot of interaction, reasonable amount with the United States, obviously more with Britain, the interaction with India, which is, after all, roughly the same size as China in terms of number of people, depending on which census figures you read as to who's a little ahead there. All of that built up a lot of trade, including in opium, but that's another issue. Interesting story, it's down if you want to sidelight. One of the major considerations with Hong Kong was the American trading there, because you had to be in Guangdong, Canton. One of the original trading houses, one of the largest houses, was a company called Russell and Company, which has connections to this area. Mr. Russell was a Yaley, sorry, so the money didn't come to Hong Kong. But when he left, he handed the reins over to his assistant over there, a guy named Warren Delano, who, not coincidentally, or maybe coincidentally, was Franklin Delano Roosevelt's grandfather. So there's a Chinese history in that progression too. This changed in the 1990s when people began to worry about Hong Kong becoming part of China. And there were worries that because China had strong currency controls, because the legal system might be compromised, if you will, by coming under Chinese control, a lot of people were scared that Hong Kong would cease to be a major international financial center. And that's why you had a large migration of people out of Hong Kong, and an even larger migration of money out of Hong Kong. It's one of the reasons why in my parents' condo in Florida, over half the condos are now owned by Chinese. People were scared. Fortunately, so far, the accession has been relatively uneventful. The legal system has been maintained in Hong Kong, and the ability to trade currency freely has remained in Hong Kong despite continued currency controls in China itself. Weirdly enough, that's now beginning to change for the opposite region. China is beginning to free up the renminbi. They allowed trading through Hong Kong 2 years ago, I believe it was. They've now allowed London to do trading in the renminbi. They're gradually making it freer, not completely free yet, but that means that Hong Kong no longer has the absolute advantage over, say, Shanghai that it did a few years ago. If you go back to the 19th century, Shanghai was the challenger to Hong Kong as the Chinese financial center. The Bund in Shanghai, the old buildings, there's a reason why the bull there matches the one at the foot of Wall Street in New York. China is trying to develop Shanghai into being a major financial center. And this is something that Hong Kong should be worried about. So far, what's happened is a neat little split of activity between Hong Kong and Shanghai. Most Chinese companies list in Shanghai. It's a much larger stock market. The biggest companies list in Hong Kong. Why do the big Chinese companies list in Hong Kong? Well, oddly enough, they list there for one primary reason, which is the accounting rules are tougher in Hong Kong. The general feeling is that the financial reports of any Chinese company should be cataloged in the fiction section of the library. Any connection between the report and anything that's actually happening in the company is purely accidental. But if you're based in Hong Kong, you have to follow Hong Kong accounting laws, which means basically British accounting rules. And that gives people a greater degree of confidence in the accounts. And companies are willing to tie their hands in order to gain credibility. They can do this by listing in Hong Kong. They can do it even more easily by moving their formal headquarters to Hong Kong. That doesn't necessarily mean they move any factories or operations there, but they can move their legal headquarters to Hong Kong. And that allows them to bind their hands, force them to comply with British accounting rules, which is pretty much a necessity to get credibility in the international financial markets. Hong Kong also remains the center for any kind of foreign exchange trading, because you're not allowed to freely trade foreign exchange out of Shanghai, which gives it a large advantage. And of course, internationally, most non-Chinese would prefer to live in Hong Kong rather than in Shanghai. I like Shanghai, it's a nice city, but these are beginning to change. My own former company, Standard & Poor's, has moved its Chinese headquarters legally from Hong Kong to Shanghai. Because there's more activity going on in Shanghai in terms of number of corporations, not necessarily in dollar value or renminbi value, but in terms of number of corporations, there's a lot more activity in Shanghai. How the Chinese government plays this out is going to determine how important the financial sector remains in Hong Kong. If there are worries that Hong Kong could be restricted, forced to comply with, say, Chinese accounting practices or lack thereof, that would be a risk for Hong Kong. Perversely, the equal risk is that China starts to adopt tougher accounting standards, which would make Shanghai a tougher competitor with Hong Kong in listing corporate securities. It's an interesting issue, both for the Chinese government and for Hong Kong itself. Ideally, I think what China would like to do is keep two major financial centers. By splitting in one way or the other the activities between the two, that's not always easy to do. If you look at the United States, though, that is true to a large extent in the United States, with options and futures activity largely centered in Chicago, while the stock market and bond activity is centered in New York. Still, New York financial market is probably 10 times the size of the Chicago market in terms of number of people. And Hong Kong wouldn't like having Shanghai 10 times the size of Hong Kong. This is going to be an issue. It's also an issue with regard to Singapore, which has maintained sort of the British system where there's less worry about it. And certainly after 1999, there was a large move of firms to Singapore from Hong Kong. Not that anybody closed up their Hong Kong office, but if you look at the staffing, it definitely moved to Singapore. Singapore is a very small place, not much room for expansion, but it's located in a more neutral area. It has closer ties to Southeast Asia, which is growing pretty rapidly at this point, not as rapidly as China, but rapidly, and to India. So Hong Kong's sort of caught here with competing with both Shanghai and Singapore, and there's a lot of issues as to which one is going to win in the longer run, or which one's going to get left behind in the longer run. Tokyo has sort of dropped out of the running even more, partially because the Tokyo market it still remains large, but it's not growing at the rate of the other countries. The long period of deflation, of extreme low interest rates, has made it an unattractive place to locate. High cost of living has been an issue. And it's just not seen as a friendly city for non-Japanese to be located. They're just not looked upon as culturally, it's harder to break in to the Japanese culture than it is to break into Hong Kong or to break into Singapore, where everybody's a foreigner in some sense. But you've got a three-way race going on now. And who wins is going to depend in part on how well the individual countries steer their own course, but also on what decisions the Chinese government makes. And how they make those decisions. Big questions are accounting standards. The other big question is convertibility of the Chinese currency. China has been complaining about the fact that everybody uses the dollar as a reserve currency. Why don't they use the renminbi? Well, there's a very simple reason. You can't use a currency for a reserve if you're not sure you can use the currency when you need it. Until China is willing to adopt full convertibility of its currency cannot be used as reserves by anybody who is rational. And you're not going to get that increase. That gets us into another set of issues, which I'm going to touch about reserves. But China has been moving towards greater convertibility. To move towards convertibility, you have to give up the idea of maintaining your currency at an artificially low level. You have to allow somewhat more fluctuation in relative exchange rates. And we'll just have to see how much the Chinese government is willing to allow that. The previous leadership seemed to be moving in that direction. Whether the new president feels the same, I don't know yet. And I don't think anybody else does either. So a lot of decisions have to be made that are going to affect Chinese treatment of Hong Kong versus Shanghai, that are going to affect the relative growth of financial markets in those two centers. And at this point, we don't know which way this is going to end up jumping. Thank you.
Pleasure to introduce Professor Weiping.
Thank you. Okay, while the technology is working, I just want to say I really thank the organizers, the student organizers. This looks to be a fantastic event. I know very little about Hong Kong, so I'm very pleased to be speaking after the two professors and two previous speakers who really have laid out the historical and the contemporary, linkages between Hong Kong and China. And so what I want to do is perhaps to continue Professor Wyss' conversation to really look at how Hong Kong, connects to the Chinese cities. And so my talk, sort of title is Hong Kong in the context of China's urbanization. And so some odd 20-some years ago when I was doing my graduate dissertation research, I actually wrote on foreign direct investment in China's special economic zones, Shenzhen, right across the border from Hong Kong. So at the time, Hong Kong was this important source not only of investment, but also technology. So in the sort of the 10 minutes or so, I wanted to kind of give you a sense of how the connection between Hong Kong and other Chinese cities really has changed in its nature. And I also like to continue with what Professor Wyss is, sort of concerned about the fight, sort of the important role of Hong Kong in the financial market, and maybe expand it to look at perhaps some questions about the depth and scope of Hong Kong's economic structure. So when I went, you could see Hong Kong was just transitioning, so that was late 80s and early 90s. Hong Kong was transitioning from a mass market manufacturer who was producing for JCPenney, Sears, and all of that major American department store chains in the 70s and 80s. But then shifting all of the manufacturing functions pretty much across the border to the north, right? So Shenzhen was a fishing village within a matter of a few years, essentially took in a great deal of Hong Kong investment. And even today, you can see Hong Kong and Macau together, in the last 20 years, it's been the single largest source of foreign direct investment for China. So again, yes, Hong Kong is part of China, but by WTO standard, it remains an independent identity. So investment from Hong Kong to China is considered foreign direct investment. And if you also know that much of foreign direct investment in China goes to the manufacturing sector. So within a matter of 10 to 15 years, in the 80s through the early 90s and so, Hong Kong essentially changed its economy from a manufacturing-heavy base to a service-based economy. Everybody agrees with that, right? So essentially, the opening of China was great timing, right? You know, labors were cheaper, standards probably, you know, environmental standards were probably lax, and the Hong Kong business people had a great deal of advantage in terms of understanding the Chinese business culture, the Guanxi network, and so on and so forth. So everybody's just thought Hong Kong was this greatest gateway to enter the Chinese market. Now, obviously, Hong Kong also was this greatest gateway for the Chinese to enter the global market, right? So at that time, Hong Kong's role was very critical, much like you know, throughout history in terms of the financial aspect and other historical linkages. And so that was, you know, 20-some years ago. And Hong Kong's direct investment into Chinese cities has basically sort of morphed into many different sectors, you know, real estate, hotels, certainly manufacturing. More and more recently, we began to see many Chinese cities using Hong Kong MTR's model in terms of transit investment, in terms of transit operation, as well as in terms of how they capture value around Hong Kong metro stations to create profits for a public sector entity. So Hong Kong has been a great sort of source of knowledge and technology for China, and particularly for cities. In the meantime, as Hong Kong made this change in its industrial structure, the Chinese cities have been growing. So this is you know, a little bit of 10 decades earlier from my field work, but you can see the sense that I talked about in this new book Professor Steinfeld mentioned, that the Chinese city. And if you look at the last 30 years or so, the pace of urbanization in the mainland China context is tremendous, right? So not only in terms of the number of cities, and particularly in terms of number of very large cities that could be in the same league as Hong Kong, just in terms of population size, but also in terms of how the agriculture sector's share and employment has really, really declined. So China is no longer what we call an agrarian society, although still a little close to half of the population lives in the countryside. So in that 20 to 30 years, Hong Kong's next door big neighbor really has modernized and grown. And so in that 20 to 30 years of time, this just also gives you a sense of how Chinese cities have been sort of growing geographically in different regions. So obviously here Hong Kong is, and it remains to be in a very important what we call urban region. But you also see the importance of a few other urban regions growing tremendously. I think the keynote speaker just before lunch talked about how Hong Kong is comfortable competing with the Lower Yangtze River Delta, the Shanghai urban region, and then move up to the Bohai Rim urban region. So those three big clusters of cities now are the key urban centers of China, and Hong Kong obviously is closely linked to the Pearl River Delta urban region. Now, so given that its early role at the beginning of the reform period for mainland China as sort of this big source of technology investment and knowledge, Hong Kong today really probably, as we could see it, aside from the financial sector, in many other sectors is in a much broader sense of collaborator with this region. So I have colleagues in Hong Kong U or Chinese Hong Kong U are looking at sort of collaboration in transport, in logistic industries, and other industries across Shenzhen, Guangzhou, and Hong Kong. So in a way forming a larger economic sphere to be, in a sense, more competitive, not just domestically, but also in the East Asia region as well as globally. You know, obviously Hong Kong's airport, the new airport, is one of the most important hubs in the world, but much of it really also depends on the hinterland beyond Hong Kong that is located in the Pearl River Delta region. So if you take a look at this, is sort of still is FDI 2008, not the sort of most recent data, but these are all two cities. And so if this map had been drawn for 1990, this red circle would be a lot bigger. So much of the investment will be focused more here. But as China opened up and other cities began to develop more steadily, the trend of foreign direct investment really has been moving up north, further north, and a little bit to the west, but generally along the coast. So in that sense, that China is increasingly becoming confident in attracting foreign direct investment, perhaps somewhat independent of Hong Kong's intermediate role in the investment and trade spheres. So, you know, when I was doing research in the early 90s in Shenzhen, you could actually see large number of Hong Kong holding companies that were really essentially sort of subsidiaries of Western companies and using Hong Kong as a gateway. And that kind of function is probably, you know, I don't have good details and good data to show that. I think Professor Steinfeld might actually have more of that. And that's probably declining. And given that Hong Kong strength today is in producer services, particularly in finance, on the other hand, the Chinese cities are continuously strong in manufacturing. So Hong Kong's sort of gateway function perhaps is less important today. And so besides the rapid growth of very large cities in China, all sort of levels, at all levels, so provincial level cities, we have 4 in China, right? Prefecture level cities are these provincial capitals and other large cities, you know, Suzhou, Hangzhou, Jinan, Qingdao, Yantai, and so on and so forth. Those are what we call prefectural level cities. Today there are 283 of them. And then even at the county level cities, the growth is tremendous. So there's sort of broad-based urban growth and in Chinese cities. So my next question then, so you understand, so that I'm trying to say that, I'm trying to avoid the word competition, but there is certainly competition. And even in the Pearl River Delta region, in our book we talked about how the competition in terms of building international airports had gone on without good coordination. So today, Zhuhai's international airport really is not international because you have Guangzhou, you have Shenzhen, and you have Hong Kong. So eventually, the central government had to step in to coordinate how different airports will be catering in different markets. But you can see the sense of Chinese cities, particularly the large ones, that they want to be. So besides Shanghai being, you know, willing to sort of stake out in the sort of term to be as a regional financial center, many other lesser cities are also competing for some functions that could be classified as quote-unquote world city functions, right? So that could be other types of producer services beyond just finance. And so the sort of growth of Chinese cities in a way is both a very positive trend for Hong Kong because you have more mature markets and more mature customers. On the other hand, could also be a pressure on Hong Kong in other sectors. So my last point I want to make is then, so if you look at the quote-unquote world cities around the world, and Professor Wyss mentioned Singapore, and then we can look at Shanghai, we can look at New York, we can look at Tokyo. The general sense is finance has been very important, although a number of scholars perhaps would agree that the importance of finance may be overplayed. So if you look at Singapore, actually, in the past 10 years or so, there's been conscious efforts to broaden or deepen the sort of economic engagement across sectors. So Singapore has done a great deal of quote-unquote innovative kinds of activities, building world-class research universities, having Western universities building campuses, in a way continue to try to beef up a manufacturing. Because actually compared to Hong Kong, Singapore continues to have a larger manufacturing sector than Hong Kong, primarily in mid-tech or high-tech, if you could call it. And then if you look at even New York, some form of manufacturing is coming back in a smaller scale. And then if you look at Shanghai, Shanghai actually continues to have very important manufacturer functions, with the exception of the very sort of low-tech, labor-intensive manufacturing industries have been sort of spread out to the hinterland, but you remain in some transport, petrochemical, and a few other heavy industry sectors remains a very large manufacturing sector. And Tokyo is, in a way, very similar. So Hong Kong, and the challenge is it going to be blossoming as primarily a financial capital of East Asia? And even with that, I want to add that there is something to say about why financial sectors concentrate in only a small number of cities, because you do take advantage of scale economies, and you simply cannot have 3 or 4 different financial capitals serving a limited market. So the competition with Singapore, with Shanghai, and perhaps even Tokyo, perhaps is not going to produce a zero-sum or what we call positive-sum game at the end. So that's actually a question for you to think about, as well as, I'm looking forward to our commentators' comments in a way of how Hong Kong would want to continue in this sort of near-term future, given that its, I guess, big neighbor is growing and getting more sophisticated, and Hong Kong's industrial or economic structure has really changed significantly in the last 30 years. Thank you very much.
Thank you. It's a lot of information, a lot of great information. Thank you to Professor Ko, Professor Wyss, and Professor Wu for all your comments. I just want to, jot down some notes. I just want to try to go over some of these points that I can think of while you were speaking. First of all, Professor Ko talked a lot about the, well, of course, the Guangzhou and Hong Kong strike and boycott of the 20s. Of course, it would be quite difficult for me to talk about that, not being a historian and so on. That history is pretty far away. And I think for most of the Hong Kong students here, I don't think, for better for worse, unfortunately, our educational system don't teach us too much about our own history in Hong Kong. That is certainly one of the many shortcomings of our educational system in Hong Kong. But at least what you have talked about do reinforce one thing that I've always believed in, is that Hong Kong actually do have a very significant and special role in in China's history, especially the recent history, in terms of the various either as a social movement, like the one that you talked about, and also even very political movements, including, for example, obviously I think Dennis in the keynote also talked about the fact that a lot of these Cantonese tend to be the troublemakers for the rulers up north. So I'm very sure that the current leadership have been taking note of that. They wouldn't forget about it. So that is always something that I think in the back of their mind, even when they look at Hong Kong's role today in the whole of China. Actually, I think also Professor Wu and Professor Wyss talked a lot about the competition and comparison with Shanghai and so on. Now, I have my own. I think a lot of the a lot of what you have mentioned, actually, I would very much agree. And in fact, a lot of people, we talk about this, we got asked about it all the time, about the comparison with Shanghai and Singapore, of course, and what do we think our future is, and so on. Well, I think there are some facts and some myths when we talk about this issue. Well, first of all, just like Professor Wyss, you mentioned that well, China is a big country, just like the US is a big country. It might be possible, and it might be actually good to have more than one centers, be it an urban center or financial service industry centers or other centers. Certainly, that's one view. But I think really, if I look at Shanghai and what they have been doing, now certainly I do agree that Hong Kong needs to be very careful, very vigilant about the development in Shanghai. But on the other hand, I think our biggest enemy is ourselves in Hong Kong. That we are too worried about what's happening in China. The problem with Hong Kong sometimes is we have, again, I talked about it last night, we have too much of a short-term mentality. So when we see a problem, I think actually also Dennis mentioned this morning that we have an immigrant mentality. So what does that mean? I move on to the next place. So if we see a problem, do we try to improve our competitiveness and fight on and become win the war against Shanghai or whatever? No, I mean a lot of times, unfortunately, many of our residents before, I hope this generation will be different because again, there's more and more of a local movement in Hong Kong. People really talking more about their roots. Now, I hope that would be a change. But otherwise, in previous generations, when we see problems, people tend to say, I gotta immigrate to another country, or in future maybe immigrate to Shanghai or move to Shanghai. So I think, but on the other hand, in reality, I think Shanghai really has a long way to go. Many of the things that has been mentioned about, for example, the free trade zone, and there's always China when it comes to reforms. Is at least in my impression, it sometimes always works out like this. It's like they would speculate what the government is going to put into the package, just like before the free trade zone, and also the terms for the Qianhai zone in Shenzhen, also another sort of free trade zone. Before the actual rules for the new regions are announced, there's always a lot of speculations about what is going to be in it. And every time, there always are a lot of these things that people would thought, oh, I think they will try it this time, but in the end, it's not in the package. I can only use some of these examples in my area, which is technology and telecom and so on. When they talked about Qianhai and also when they talk about the Shanghai Free Trade Zone, a lot of people are expecting that, oh, they are going to be putting on make it a special zone so that people can get onto Facebook in the special zone. In other words, put it outside of the Great Firewall of China. It didn't happen. So I think the expectation and the pace of the opening up, and I'm saying it not trying to make ourselves in Hong Kong feel better, but in reality, a lot of times they are actually really slower than one would expect, because I think they would have a lot of other consideration about possibly, would it be destabilizing other things that they are trying to defend and so on. Think about it. I mean, even if China, in terms of the free trade zone and in Shanghai and so on, opening up certain cities, it is still a partial opening. And compared to what we have in Hong Kong, which again, many of these factors, for example, the rule of law, predictability, and so on, it will take a lot more than very specific opening up of certain terms in certain areas. There's still a lot of the big difference between that. And at least what we can see right now is that, yes, we do have a lot of, actually still, even for not just for international companies, but actually even for mainlanders, there's still a lot of attraction coming to Hong Kong. I think money, that I think also Dennis mentioned this morning about many Chinese people, they want to move their money into Hong Kong and so on. But one thing that he hasn't mentioned this morning would be the passport. You know, they all want a Hong Kong passport. And it's easy to understand because they could use this passport visa-free, go to, so I mean it's great for businessmen. So they would love to, at least in the past. It's getting increasingly difficult because it's too many of them doing this. Our government is sort of raising the bar. But still, I mean, if you spend a few $1 million or $10 million investment, you can think about this investment as if just buying a passport. It would be worthwhile for many of these big tycoons and businessmen in China because of the convenience. I talk to many of them. They say, after I get this passport, it's like great. It's totally different because I could hop on the plane to go to, all these countries, and otherwise, if I'm taking my Chinese passport, it would take me forever, and so on. So these are some of the issues that I think, still part of our competitiveness. But I think, okay, let me look at my notes. Let me jump to, okay. But I think. But I think having said all these, I think Hong Kong should really still be worried about these competition. And we have to enhance our sense of crisis and urgency and so on. And again, I think maybe really our biggest enemy is not necessarily the competition itself, but our own mentality. How do we deal with these changes? Now, so how do we change? What are the things that we need to do in order to continue to compete? Professor Wyss talked about really depending on the national strategy, the strategy of the central government and so on. Now that's one thing, but that to me is a little bit passive. So what else can we do? One of the things that I have been thinking about, and particularly when Professor Wu also talked about the regional situation and so on, one thing I thought about is what about the integration with the Pearl River Delta? Further integration. Right now, I mean, there's certain integration, but still a border, and there's still, it's still basically, two different regions and so on. Some people talked of that, but of course the problem that we have in terms of really making such an integration, any sort of integration happen, is probably more political than anything else. So actually, I would like to hear also, our panelists to give me a response. Again, Hong Kong is small. We don't have enough land, and actually, we don't even have enough people. A lot of times, you look at the major megacities that are being developed all over the world. They're much bigger than 7 or 8 million people. And if we are going to have the sort of development in terms of having a megacity, a lot of people in 10 or 15 million people, just cannot imagine how we are going to be squeezing everybody into the area that we have in Hong Kong. So, but again, all these political issues, and again, with because of maybe some of the mismanagement in the past 17 years, a lot of these conflicts and local movement feelings against the integration with the mainland that we have in Hong Kong. How do we deal with that? That is actually one of my questions as well. And yeah, finally, I just want to make a quick response to Professor Wu about what you talked about, the Singapore situation and how they're doing with diversifying their economy. And actually, that was one thing that I mentioned also last night when I spoke about the fact that Singapore actually, I agree. I talked about it last night too, that they have been continuously investing into their research, and industries rather than like Hong Kong, just especially after the handover, it's been just focusing entirely on the financial service, which they talk about, and property, which they don't talk about. But in reality, just focusing on these two sectors. But then again, I think actually a response is that actually the Hong Kong government at least saying that they are going to be in this year's policy address and the budget speech has been saying that the government will re-establish a bureau to look after innovation technology, and they are starting to sort of experiment about a few things that will try to encourage more innovative research and so on. But I think up to now, I do see that Singapore, the way that Singapore is going about doing it, is a bit different from the way that Hong Kong is probably looking at going about doing it. Singapore, as you said, has been investing in a lot of these big name companies, trying to go over to them with large subsidies and so on. This seems like politically and so on, it's very difficult for Hong Kong to follow. People just, for better for worse, Hong Kong people just hate it when we hear that, okay, we're going to give 10 million to IBM or even local companies, whatever, to do certain things. They just thought, oh, this is unfair. So actually, we do see a lot. On the other hand, it seems like we do have a much more vibrant startup and SMEs type of mentality and effort. Now, I don't think either on its own is enough, but at least I can see that Singapore is doing a bit, and their strategy in terms of fostering innovation technology in the way that we are saying that we would want to do it is slightly different. But in fact, I share the view that actually we do have to find ways to attract more larger companies to come to Hong Kong as anchor. But on the other hand, we do see that in Singapore, probably because of other issues that they have and the mentality and so on, they don't seem to have developed this kind of vibrant or whatever the startup scenes as we have been doing in the past. So anyway, that would be my quick response. Thank you.
Thank you. We have a bit of time, so I want to open up the forum to questions. Questions? Yeah, go ahead in the back.
So my question actually sort of builds off the point you made about the current Hong Kong political scene having this it's been raised previously, but this very sort of almost nationalistic emergence. Sorry, I guess I'll say again. So the Hong Kong political scene, there's a lot of resistance towards integration with China. For example, the high-speed rail line, the Chinese shoppers. And I wonder, especially as Hong Kong moves for democracy, which we've been talking about this whole morning, how we can reconcile democracy in Hong Kong with closer economic integration with China. And if there was, how do you see the future of the economic relationship if Hong Kong did achieve more political independence from the mainland?
Okay, just short answer. I think it's a great question. Actually, what you talked about, what is actually on the mind of a lot of the people who are actually even opposed to faster pace for democracy and so on, they would think that, okay, well, if there's too much of these, if there's more democracy, and then people would be very narrow-minded and locally focused, and then it would not be good for our economic future, particularly. I think most people, if they really look at the economics, they would probably agree that Hong Kong cannot really survive as an independent state or region without any cooperation with China or collaborations. So, but having said that, I think sometimes you really have to let go. China, I mean, that's the problem. I mean, the leaders in China, are they willing to let us go? And then there won't be such an antagonistic feeling between the two sides. And so that actually, I mean, look at it. I mean, Hong Kong people actually most people are really very, they really don't look at collaborations with China and integration with China in such a light as those, in the same light as those protesters that we talked about this morning. That's really a small minority. But the thing is, if are the rulers in Beijing, which after all really holds the key, they lock it or they unlock it, are they going to let us go? Take it easy on us, and then we can have a chance to really, oh, great, you know, everybody would look at our big daddy in Beijing and say, great, you are a really reformist and understanding and liberal bunch and give us all these freedom. We will do our best to help the motherland, right? And help ourselves. So I don't know, I mean, I hope that would happen. But of course, you know, these are communists that we're talking with. Will they so easily, you know, give us this sort of freedom to go ahead and so on? I don't know. I mean, but I hope they would understand that actually that's all we're talking about.
Yeah, Mark.
I actually have a question about Hong Kong's competitiveness, and that came out of a lunch conversation that I had with a number of the students here, which was really fascinating. And quite a number of them said they're not going back to Hong Kong because the startup scene is not great. That is, that culturally, Hong Kong is not able to, you know, accept you if you're not going to a certain school or with a certain financial backing and so on. And so I'd like you to kind of comment on that, both for the students here and also maybe also hear from David Wyss too, whether indeed Hong Kong has the capacity to support that kind of startup mentality that will help Hong Kong be a second financial center, much like Chicago or San Francisco with its Silicon, you know, Valley economy.
I think there's a couple of issues here. First of all, it depends on what kind of a startup they're looking at. Generally, one of the issues for Hong Kong was brought up before is that Hong Kong does have a manufacturing hinterland. The problem is you've got to have a passport to get across it. From a standpoint of establishing manufacturing, that has not been a big problem. But it does mean if you're going to do a startup in Hong Kong, you've got to accept the fact that your manufacturing facilities are going to be in Shenzhen or somewhere else. Not try to do it in Hong Kong because Hong Kong is not competitive in terms of manufacturing costs for anything except probably some specialty stuff. Money's there, and I haven't seen, I know a fair number of people who have gone back there that have, usually worked with their own companies and setting up firms, but I haven't seen that any of them have had any big problems in getting funding.
I mean, would you say these financial sector is willing to fund, and this was actually on the NPR story when I was driving down, they were talking about how Google and Microsoft, when they first started, they didn't go to MIT, they didn't go to the East Coast funders because they'll get laughed out of the banking, with their hippie outfits and driving a Volkswagen bus, and so they went to San Francisco.
Yeah,
and so then the question is that will Hong Kong invest?
At this point, you do not have the initial stage of venture capital for high-tech ventures in Hong Kong because there is not an adequate high-tech sector established there. That I think will grow, but it'll grow the same way as it did in the United States. And remember, a lot of high-tech firms did start on the East Coast. A lot of them have gone out of business too. But places like Digital and the Sun was really an East Coast operation until it moved out to Silicon Valley. You can, but that funding is probably, that initial stage venture capital, private equity funding is still a bit scarce in China generally.
Yeah, maybe, yeah, I'll just add a little bit. I think, Mr. Mark is absolutely right. Hong Kong has always been very sort of entrepreneur in terms of small and medium-sized enterprises, SMEs, but they generally are pretty standardized operations and family business governance structure. So in that sense, it's not really very modern. And also, if you look at the circuits of sort of the brain circulation, it's, certainly from Silicon Valley to Hsinchu High-Tech Park in Taiwan, and then to Zhongguancun in Beijing, it sort of bypasses Hong Kong. Really, if you look at Hong Kong universities, I can't sort of name names really, but you can't really think of who really sort of are on the cutting edge of whatever particular kind of technology. And then now in China, there is this sort of nascent domestic venture capital growth. But then again, is not from Hong Kong investors. There are a number of them actually are Chinese who've been working in Silicon Valley and then going back to cultivate the startups within China. So I think that relates to Mr. Mark's comment about how Hong Kong needs to cultivate sort of the innovative economy because a lot of these circuits actually really bypass Hong Kong.
I think you should say too that Taiwan has done a much better job of this.
That's correct.
than Hong Kong.
Yeah.
I am a proponent in this area, so I have to make my response. Actually, I talked last night, almost until after 11 o'clock with a number of students. And we were exactly talking about this topic, which is encouraging to me because they are thinking about it. And first of all, I myself actually worked in the U.S. after I graduated from a Midwest engineering school. And I started working in the U.S. And actually, the first company I worked with was digital. And so I worked in the Boston area, that was like they were beginning to go downhill. And I moved over to Silicon Valley. I worked there for a couple more years. And before I went back to Hong Kong to start up. So actually, first of all, these two things, staying in the U.S. and doing and start working, and going back to startup at some stage are not mutually exclusive. In fact, it might work out to your advantage to really understand the kind of culture and the kind of environment and how Silicon Valley or other tech centers here, they talk about Austin now, how these places work. It's actually, you can think of it that way. You start to have an understanding about how things work in a major, tech country or tech environment before you go to Hong Kong or other places to pursue your career. That's the first thing I want to say. Well, having said that, truly, yeah, I do agree that Hong Kong, in terms of startup ecosystem, we don't have a very mature or complete ecosystem. And by saying that, several things, like manpower supply, the local market, and especially, I believe, in terms of VC, venture capitalist culture as well as its presence, it's not enough. But on the other hand, I think I mentioned just now that in fact the startup scene is being like almost on fire the last couple of years. We've gone from having no co-working space to almost 30 now. Every other month, there seems to be a new one coming up. Whether or not they're just providing good services, that I don't know. But at least in terms of number, that means that that means there is a market. Recently, Chinese universities, they work with Google to start a mentorship program for startups. They were expecting 300 people to sign up to support, and then ended up with 800 people, and they didn't want to turn anybody away, so they took 800 in. So yeah, things are beginning to change, and all this is largely because of technological change. Much easier to start up now. Cloud computing, apps, all these platforms, it just doesn't take much effort and money or capital to start. But again, I think it's ourselves, Hong Kong people, including maybe some of you, our own mentality is our biggest enemy. Time and time again in Hong Kong, I talk to these university students, they always complain, our government isn't doing enough for me, if I'm starting up, no support. And I said, do you know what are the plans that are out there? They have never heard of them. So I encourage any one of you next time if you come back to Hong Kong for your holidays and whatever you want to see, the startup scenes and so on, I'll take you to or point you to some of these centers and so on, and you will have a feel. I'm not saying that it's the best or whatever, but things are beginning to change. And the ironic thing is, and I mentioned it last night to some of the students as well, in these startup center efforts in Science Park, in our Science Park, in our Cyberport, and many of these co-working space and so on, you see so many foreign faces. People from Eastern Europe, Europe in general, even Africa. People who came to study on exchange program and they want to stay because they think that this is a great place to starting up. Everything is relative. They think, oh, Europe's economy, I better come to Hong Kong. I don't want to do it in Shanghai. It's too risky for the moment and so on. Hong Kong is safer, or a lot of other factors. They want to be in Hong Kong, and they think it's close to the biggest market. And so these days, sometimes we feel that they are even more excited than our own people about our own prospect. And last thing I really want to say is that high tech is, I assume that if we're talking about startups, of course there are many different kinds. If it's manufacturing, then it might be different. But at least for technology, things change so quickly. The good thing is maybe I'm too much of a proponent, but I would think that it's never too late. Because next time, it's going to be something new. You miss this trend, this wave, next time it would be something else. So, maybe I'm trying to be positive.
Thank you. More questions? Maybe all the way in the back, I see a hand.
Well, this is a question primarily for David. To what extent does Hong Kong's legal system provide a comparative advantage vis-a-vis Shanghai? Because earlier in your remarks, you talked about how important legal system was for the rise of Singapore and Hong Kong, but then you moved to stress different accounting standards. So what about the legal piece of the puzzle?
Well, I mean, the accounting standards are part of the legal system.
Sure, yeah. But I mean, more generally.
Yeah. The legal system people see as much more predictable in Hong Kong than it is in China. It's also much tighter in terms of what you have to do, what you have to report as a company. From a standpoint of corporate credibility, there is very little corporate credibility with any Chinese corporation. But if you're headquartered in Hong Kong, you get a higher degree of credibility. Now, I still doubt a lot of their books as to what they're doing outside of Hong Kong. But at least, it's audited. It's audited to reasonable Western standards. It may not be completely out of the fiction section of the library, but at least it's not in the fantasy.
I'm also thinking of transactional work too, enforcement of contracts and all of that.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's part of this too. That
Right.
People, if you write a contract in Hong Kong subject to Hong Kong law, you pretty much know how the courts are going to rule. You're not so sure in China, because the rules are changing in China, and they can be overridden. And the feeling is they can be overridden pretty quickly if the right person wants them overridden. So, yeah, there's a feeling that Hong Kong is much safer, more predictable. You know what you're buying. You don't quite know that in Shanghai.
Yes.
I have a question for Professor Wyss. You mentioned some things about currency control, and as you know now, the Hong Kong dollar is pegged to the US dollar because a lot of people favor that, partly because it's very stable as a currency, and there's been recently some discussion about depegging from the US dollar into the renminbi. Do you have any thoughts or opinions about advantages or disadvantages?
Yeah, I've had that discussion actually over there. In the long run, Hong Kong will not have a different currency than China. There'll be a common currency, so the dollar peg is not going to last forever. The renminbi has been pretty stable against the dollar. It's been going up gradually to eliminate the frankly deliberate undervaluation that was built into it. As the Hong Kong dollar as the renminbi becomes convertible, you're going to see more pressure for the Hong Kong dollar to tie to the renminbi instead of the US dollar. And I don't think that's a bad thing. But but as long as you have currency controls, you can still maintain the dual system. As those currency controls become relaxed, as the renminbi becomes more convertible, you're going to see more pressure to move Hong Kong to the renminbi. It could be worse. You realize that Zimbabwe has just adopted the renminbi as one of its 8 legal tender currencies.
Thank you. Any other questions? Yeah, go ahead.
So there's a lot of talk about the lack of innovation in Hong Kong, but what has the Chinese government done for like mainland China? I know there's a lot of tech startups coming out of China now. You talk about WeChat, which when you compare it to WhatsApp, which was bought for 19 billion, and had like 4 million users. WeChat is going to be, there's going to talk about being being valued at 60 billion because there's just so many more users. And when you talk about like monsters like Alibaba and Baidu, what has the Chinese government done that the Hong Kong government hasn't done that has allowed those companies to be so successful?
No,
Okay, the first wave of internet companies and so on in China that became very successful and highly valued and so on, I think many people would look at them as imitators. You know, of course, I still believe that, you know, if you look at WeChat, you know, some of the functions that they have compared to WhatsApp, or if you look at the Weibo and you look at the functions that they have compared to Twitter and so on, actually they are superior. So they do imitate, but they also innovate. But there are a couple of issues. First of all, I think so far they found it very difficult to get out of the China market and come near any sort of dominance or any competitive status outside of China, maybe except within the Chinese community. That seemed to be you know, a problem that you can see with all these companies, Tencent, you know, Alibaba and Sina and so on. They share the same problem. And of course, even if you look at some of the other hardware-oriented technology companies, they face another different issue, like Huei and CTE and so on. These companies try to come to outside market, to Europe and to the US and so on. They, you know, these governments simply don't want them to be in here. Probably because the US government knows what is in Cisco's, and then some Cisco people here, right? They probably know what they put into Cisco's machine, you know, all these backdoors and so on. Then they didn't really want any Chinese company to put their hardware into the US. So hardware companies face an even harder difficulty in terms of expanding to the global market, except maybe the third world. You know, they do very well in Africa and things places like that. So the other thing is that China has been very successful. You see them building these companies, and they all become very big. And part of it is because I think in China, because of the network control that they have, they would prefer each industry, each service to be dominated by a small number of players that naturally would become very cooperative with the regime. And you see that happening already with all these companies like that, the ones that I mentioned. You know, if something happens, I want some certain information from you, data you need to provide to me, you know, national security or even other reasons, you know, if I need to block this particular keyword and so on, they do it immediately. So they don't want a market that is very competitive with a lot of small players and so on. So you see, actually the first player that copied Twitter was a company called Fanfao or something like that, right? It was, yeah, the first company that copied Twitter. And they were quickly shut down, giving other companies, including Sohu, Sina, and so on, at least almost a year's lead time to copy from the copycat to launch their services, because those companies are big. They are more trusted in the eyes of the regime. So in that sense, actually, it's quite difficult sometimes to be an innovator or even a startup in China, because I mean, a lot of quite a few of the Hong Kong startups are beginning to feel that way too, because they used to say that I gotta get into the China market, and then they found out before they got a foot in the door, they'll be copied. And so nowadays, many of them do actually prefer to come over to the US or the Western market instead.
I mean, basically, one of the problems is if you go into the Chinese market, you're stuck in the Chinese market. there's a huge trade barrier called the Great Firewall of China that effectively isolates the Chinese market from the rest of the world. They don't have to compete with the Western companies because the Western companies can't operate. You can't look at Facebook. You can't use Twitter inside China. You can't. You're not supposed to. Yeah, these are, and that you got 1.2 billion people inside that wall. That allows you to build a pretty darn big company.
Yeah, although, I just want to add really quickly, although I think the technology has facilitated a lot of small business in China to reach to the Western market, so a lot of what we call C2C, customer to customer, particularly very small businesses that don't go through large clearinghouse anymore, and they reach markets directly overseas. That is less reported and studied, but really it's going on quite a bit.
We have time for one last quick question. Yeah, in the back, go ahead.
Okay, so Hong Kong is pretty dependent on mainland China for much of its water and energy resources. I'm just like wondering how much of a barrier that is for helping Hong Kong achieve like political independence, and if it does, will they have to start sourcing resources from other countries? And how that would drive like prices of like water and energy.
Great. From a planner's perspective? Yeah.
I mean, Hong Kong is not, I guess, unique in that. Singapore is the same. Japan to some extent is the case as well. I think there's a great deal of latitude in terms of what Hong Kong has in terms of negotiation, but it certainly is big. I mean, I think I'll let Mr. Hawk talk about sort of the internal politics, but Hong Kong is not unique in that sense.
First of all, I don't know how much we're looking for in terms of political independence from China, but yeah, certainly I think Professor Wu is absolutely right that it may not be unique, and there may not be really true energy and water and other sort of independence that we can achieve because Hong Kong is such a small place. Our energy obviously still has to rely on quite a bit of energy that's generated by, especially like it or not, the nuclear plants that are in China. I don't know whether that's a good thing because they're still pretty close to Hong Kong, but short of that, what are the alternatives? In terms of water, just one piece of update. The government in its current budget has proposed to go ahead with a water purification facility in Hong Kong to sort of alleviate our reliance on the Donggang, the water from the Pearl River. But I think that is more because of the concern about the quality of the water that we get from them. Because of all these pollution and so on, rather than because we want to try to get more independence.
I can provide some kind of similarity about the pursuit of more like Cantonese autonomy or the pretension of Hong Kong's unique status in China in recent years, and the pursuit about the federalist movement about the Canton for Cantonese in the early 1920s. And then I think that around the time when Sun Yat-sen decided to form a closer connection with the communist campaign, and I think Hong Kong bourgeoisie, they were supporting Chen Zhongming. There's another Cantonese military leaders' agenda of Canton for Cantonese, more like a federalist framework. To reconstruct the political order in China. I think the strategy they took was really not really in terms of independence of Hong Kong as either a British colony or. I think they were more like to form a closer. A political connection, along the southern province like Guangdong and Fujian. And then so eventually military leaders, after Chen Zhongming's power collapsed in the early 1920s, and many of his followers in the 1930s actually become important leaders in either the Fujian political independence in 1933 or later under the Liangguang incident. I mean the integration between Guangdong and Guangxi military power to confront Chiang Kai-shek's Nanjing government in the middle of 1930s. And then these people in the middle of World War II, they were very important supporter of the Democratic League. I mean, and then they eventually become a very important factor for Chiang Kai-shek's consolidation of his rule after the end of World War II, and Minmeng or Democratic League. I mean, many of them were actually important Cantonese leader along the Shen Zhongming campaign from the 1920s, and they become active in 1930. In the 40s, they supported the Communist Party, and then through their emphasis about independence, or they took Hong Kong as an important base. I mean, to pursue a more like a southern autonomy. And then they eventually play a very important role to shape modern Chinese history. So that's still about the importance of Hong Kong, not by itself, but I mean in terms of its impact about Chinese development.
Fantastic, thanks. Unfortunately, our time is up, but I want to take the opportunity to thank you all for participating, for your great questions, and I especially want to thank the panel for really fantastic presentations.